The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the walls were holding their breath, and when the judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the man standing alone at the defense table, everyone sensed that this was not just another case number stamped into a dusty legal record, but a moment where truth, lies, guilt, and redemption were about to collide, because the man was Ethan Cole, 39 years old, once a celebrated financial prodigy, once a devoted husband, once a father who used to kneel on the bedroom floor every night to help his daughter pray before sleep, and now a defendant accused of orchestrating the largest corporate fraud in the state's history, a crime that had allegedly destroyed pensions, ruined lives, driven 3 employees to suicide, and cost the public nearly $2 billion. Yet as Ethan lifted his eyes, there was no arrogance in them, no fear either, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a truth too heavy to share. While the prosecutor rose confidently, a man polished by victories, speaking in crisp sentences about numbers, shell companies, forged signatures, and intent, painting Ethan as a cold architect of greed, a wolf in a tailored suit who smiled while others burned, and the jury listened because the story made sense. It always does when blame has a face, but what the prosecutor did not say, what the files did not capture, was the slow suffocation that had begun 5 years earlier when Ethan discovered that the company he helped build was laundering money for a political consortium tied to international arms trafficking, a discovery that arrived not like thunder but like poison, quietly, invisibly, spreading through his blood as he realized that exposing it would not lead to applause or justice but to his family's annihilation, because 2 nights after he accessed the encrypted ledgers, a black SUV followed his wife home from work, and the next morning a photo was slid under his office door, showing his daughter at school with a red circle around her face. And from that moment Ethan's life stopped being about right and wrong and became about survival, a truth he tried to tell the authorities anonymously, only to discover that the very agency he contacted was already compromised, forcing him into a corner where every move was watched, every email traced, every breath monitored. And so when the prosecutor claimed motive was greed, Ethan almost laughed, because greed was loud and reckless, while his actions were quiet, desperate, surgical, and born from terror. And as his defense attorney sat silent by design, allowing the prosecution's narrative to mature like a noose tightening around the jury's collective neck, Ethan understood that the system needed him to be guilty because the alternative, that corruption ran so deep it consumed its own watchdogs, was too frightening to confront. And when the judge finally nodded for the defense to speak, Ethan stood before anyone could stop him, his voice calm but cracked at the edges, and said, "Before you decide who I am, before you reduce me to a balance sheet and a headline, you should know that every dollar I moved illegally was tracked, recorded, and rerouted into an escrow vault that federal agents seized this morning. And the reason you are hearing about it now is because today was the first day my family was safe." And a murmur rippled through the room. The judge slammed his gavel. The prosecutor objected furiously, but the damage was done, because truth has a frequency that cannot be unheard. And Ethan continued, explaining how he played the villain so the real monsters would reveal themselves, how he signed documents with shaking hands while men with guns watched from parked cars, how he memorized license plates instead of bedtime stories, how he learned that courage is not loud but lonely. And as he spoke, the jury's faces changed, not into sympathy but into confusion, the most dangerous emotion for a lie, because confusion invites questions, and questions unravel empires. And somewhere in the back row, a federal marshal received a message confirming that 12 high-ranking officials were being arrested simultaneously across 3 states, validating Ethan's words in real time. And the judge's expression shifted from authority to gravity as he realized that this courtroom was no longer judging a criminal but witnessing the exposure of a rot that had been feeding for decades. And Ethan ended not with a plea for freedom but with a confession of fear, admitting he broke the law, admitting he lied, admitting he became what he hated so his daughter could grow up without looking over her shoulder. And when he finally sat down, the silence returned, heavier than before, because everyone understood that justice is not always clean. Sometimes it is carved from sacrifice, and as the judge ordered a recess, the prosecutor avoided Ethan's eyes, knowing that history had just chosen its version of the truth, and this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would reach far beyond that room. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed in a way no one could quite name, as if the air itself had learned something it could not forget, and Ethan Cole remained seated with his hands folded, staring not at the judge or the jury but at the thin scratch on the wooden table that he had been tracing with his thumb for weeks, because focusing on small things was how he survived panic, and the prosecutor, now visibly unsettled, attempted to regain control by reframing the narrative, arguing that even if larger conspiracies existed, Ethan had still knowingly committed crimes, still authorized illegal transfers, still allowed innocent employees to take the fall, and at that point a former accountant was called to testify, a woman named Marissa Hale whose voice shook as she described signing documents she didn't understand under pressure from upper management. Yet when the defense asked who exactly gave those orders, her eyes drifted to Ethan and then away, and the courtroom felt the weight of omission, because silence can accuse louder than words, and Ethan closed his eyes as memories flooded back of the night he begged Marissa to leave the company, sliding an envelope of cash across a diner table, telling her to disappear without explanation, knowing that she would one day hate him for it, and now here she was, alive, while others were not, and that was the cruel arithmetic he lived with, as witnesses continued to parade through the stand, analysts, auditors, executives, each adding another layer of guilt while unknowingly confirming Ethan's deeper truth, because none of them could explain where the money ultimately went, only that it vanished beyond their reach, and then the defense finally presented its evidence, not theatrically but methodically, revealing timestamp files, encrypted backups, offshore vault records, and internal messages that showed Ethan repeatedly attempting to slow transactions, create paper trails, and redirect funds into traceable channels, actions previously interpreted as manipulation but now reframed as resistance, and the jury leaned forward collectively as patterns emerged, not of a mastermind but of a man buying time, stalling an engine he could not shut off without causing an explosion. And when the judge allowed Ethan to speak again, he did not raise his voice, he did not dramatize. He simply told them about the first time he realized someone had broken into his house without stealing anything, about finding his daughter's toy placed carefully on the kitchen counter like a calling card, about the email that arrived minutes later with only 2 words, "We are close," and how from that day forward, every choice he made was poisoned by fear, because heroism looks simple in stories but in real life it costs too much, and he admitted that he chose the lesser evil without knowing if it truly was lesser. And the jury saw not a savior but a human being drowning while trying to keep others afloat, and as the prosecution attempted one final attack by suggesting Ethan could have gone public, could have become a whistleblower, Ethan responded quietly that whistleblowers need someone willing to listen, and when the listeners are already paid, the whistle becomes a death sentence, and that line landed not as rhetoric but as resignation, because everyone in that room knew it was true, and when closing arguments ended, the jury disappeared behind closed doors carrying not certainty but burden, and hours stretched into an eternity where Ethan imagined every possible outcome, prison, acquittal, exile, anonymity, knowing that no verdict could return what he had lost, because his wife's eyes had never looked at him the same since the night he refused to explain everything, choosing her anger over her danger, and when the jury finally returned, faces pale, hands trembling, the foreperson stood and delivered a verdict that fractured the room, finding Ethan guilty on lesser charges and not guilty on the central conspiracy, an impossible compromise that reflected the moral chaos of the case, and the judge recessed sentencing, acknowledging openly that this court had encountered something the law was never designed to fully address, because legality and justice had parted ways long ago, and as Ethan was led away, not in triumph or defeat but in quiet acceptance, he passed Marissa in the aisle, and for the first time she met his eyes and nodded, not in forgiveness but in understanding. And in that moment Ethan realized that survival was never about escaping punishment but about ensuring that the truth, however damaged, lived on, because someday his daughter would ask who he really was, and the answer would not be found in a verdict but in the wreckage he chose to stand in rather than run from. The sentencing day arrived without ceremony, no reporters crowding the steps this time, no dramatic entrances, only a grey morning that mirrored the mood inside the courtroom where Ethan Cole stood once more, thinner now, older somehow, as if the months of testimony had aged him years, and the judge reviewed letters submitted on Ethan's behalf, some from former employees whose lives had quietly been spared, others from strangers who had pieced together the truth after the arrests that followed. The trial, and then letters condemning him, written by those who needed a villain to make sense of their losses, and both kinds of letters were read with equal weight because justice does not choose sides, it measures consequences. And when the prosecutor recommended a reduced sentence acknowledging extraordinary circumstances, his voice carried no victory, only fatigue, because even he understood that this case would follow him long after his career ended. And when the judge finally addressed Ethan directly, the courtroom leaned in again, not for a ruling but for meaning, and the judge spoke of a system built for clarity being forced to operate in shadows, of laws that punish action but struggle to recognize intention, and then invited Ethan to speak one last time, and Ethan did not hesitate, because this was not a defense anymore, it was a reckoning, and he began by apologizing not to the court but to the families who lost everything, admitting that no explanation could refill an empty account or resurrect a future that had collapsed, and then his voice hardened, not with anger but with resolve, as he described the illusion of choice people imagine exists in moments of crisis, explaining that when power corners you, morality stops being a compass and becomes a weight, and he told them how every night in his cell he replayed the moment he could have walked away and accepted the consequences, and how each time that fantasy ended with a knock on a door and a child screaming. And he said that if the price of keeping that from happening was his freedom, then he would pay it without asking for mercy, because courage does not always look like defiance, sometimes it looks like endurance. And as he spoke, the judge removed his glasses, the jury members stared at the floor, and even the bailiff swallowed hard, because Ethan was not performing, he was surrendering, and when the judge finally pronounced the sentence, 8 years with eligibility for parole in 3, citing cooperation, mitigation, and the unprecedented exposure of institutional corruption, there was no gasp, no reaction, only a quiet acceptance that settled over the room, and as Ethan was led away, he caught sight of his wife standing in the back, their eyes meeting briefly, and for the first time she did not look angry or afraid, only tired, and that was enough, because forgiveness is not always spoken. Sometimes it is simply the absence of blame, and years later, long after the headlines faded, and new scandals replaced old ones, Ethan would sit in a prison library helping other inmates write letters to their children, teaching them how to explain absence without lies, and one afternoon a guard would hand him an envelope containing a drawing of a courthouse with a small figure standing alone beneath it, and on the back, in uneven handwriting, his daughter would write, "They told me you were a bad man, but my teacher says bad men don't protect others when it costs them everything." And Ethan would close his eyes and breathe, knowing that history might never clear his name completely, but truth had a way of surviving in quiet places, and that in the end, being judged by the world mattered far less than being understood by the one person he chose to sacrifice it for. Prison was not the violence Ethan had imagined in his nightmares but something slower and far more corrosive, a routine designed to erase individuality through repetition, where days blurred into one another and time moved in circles rather than forward. Yet within that monotony Ethan discovered a different kind of reckoning, because stripped of suits, screens, and strategy, he was left alone with the question he had postponed for years, whether the person he became under pressure was still the person he wanted to be remembered as, and every morning he woke before count, sitting on the edge of his bunk listening to the breathing of men who had also made impossible choices for smaller reasons, and he began to understand that guilt was not a sentence handed down by a judge but a companion that followed you everywhere, and so he volunteered for the education wing, tutoring inmates who could not read, because teaching others to understand words felt like a way of rebuilding meaning from fragments, and in quiet moments he replayed the faces of those harmed by the collapse of the company, acknowledging that even justified actions leave wreckage, and that was the price of operating in a broken system. And then one winter evening a new inmate arrived, a former government contractor whose presence unsettled Ethan immediately, because he spoke in the same coded language, carried the same watchful eyes, and when they finally talked, the man confirmed what Ethan had suspected, that the corruption exposed in the trial was only one limb of a larger organism that had simply shed its skin and moved on, and that revelation ignited something dangerous inside Ethan, a mix of rage and responsibility, because he realized that silence now would not protect anyone, and yet speaking again might cost him what little peace he had earned, and when a journalist began requesting interviews years later, sensing unfinished truths, Ethan refused at first, understanding how narratives are consumed rather than understood, but eventually he agreed to write instead, not accusations, not exposés, but a detailed account of systems rather than villains, choices rather than heroes, and his words circulated quietly through academic circles, law schools, ethics committees, shaping discussions without spectacle, and the irony was not lost on him that his most honest work would never make headlines, because truth rarely does when it refuses to simplify itself. And when parole finally came, it did not feel like freedom but like responsibility renewed, and as he stepped outside the gates, older, slower, but clearer, he understood that the measure of a life is not found in how loudly it ends but in what it leaves behind when the noise fades, and though the world would always debate his guilt, the people who mattered most knew the cost he paid, and that knowledge, fragile and incomplete, was enough to carry him forward into whatever came next. Freedom, when it finally arrived, did not feel like release but like exposure, as if the walls that once confined Ethan Cole had also protected him from the expectations of the world, and stepping back into ordinary life meant confronting a reality that had continued without him, where buildings stood taller, faces looked younger, and his name existed only as a faint echo attached to old articles and unresolved arguments. And he moved carefully through this new version of existence, taking a modest teaching position under a different title, avoiding attention not out of shame but out of understanding, because he had learned that visibility is a currency and he had spent all of his, and yet his past refused to stay buried, surfacing in classrooms when students debated ethics without knowing he had lived inside the questions they treated as theory, and sometimes he would listen silently as they argued about right and wrong in absolutes, knowing that absolutes only exist where fear has never been invited into the room, and at home his relationship with his daughter grew slowly, not through dramatic reunions but through shared breakfasts, long walks, and honest answers to hard questions, and when she asked him if he would do it all again, he did not lie, telling her that he wished for a world where he would never have to choose, but that wishing does not absolve responsibility, and years later, when a national commission quietly reopened investigations based on the frameworks Ethan had written, no one called him a hero, no one apologized, but policies changed, safeguards strengthened, and invisible lives were protected in ways statistics would never fully capture. And on a cold evening after a lecture he gave anonymously, Ethan stood alone outside an empty courthouse, the same kind of building that once decided his fate, and he realized that justice is not a destination but a process carried forward by imperfect people willing to accept imperfect outcomes. And that redemption is not granted by verdicts or public forgiveness but earned daily through restraint, honesty, and the refusal to turn pain into bitterness. And as he walked away, blending into the crowd, it became clear that his story was never meant to be remembered as a triumph or a tragedy but as a question left behind for others to answer when power asks too much and fear demands silence, because in the end, the true measure of a life is not whether it remained clean, but whether it chose to matter when staying clean was no longer an option.